A suicide bomber affiliated with ISIS detonated himself at Mar Elias Church in Damascus, killing at least 25 people. Well, Uzai Bulut, a journalist who covers Christian persecution in the Middle East, joins us now. Uzai, what can you tell us about this horrific event?
Well, yesterday, jihadist terrorists in Damascus attacked a Greek Orthodox church, murdering around 25 people, injuring around 80 people. 30 of them are still in critical condition. And I've spoken with several Christians in Syria and members of the Syrian Christian diaspora. They all say that their family members in Syria are very concerned and fearful because they have no protection and life has become very unpredictable since the Al Qaeda affiliated group HTS conquered Damascus in 2024. So these people have been traumatized by all the violence and persecution they've been exposed to for decades now.
So let's say my friend here is just kind of starting to understand the situation of Christians in Syria and how precarious it is. But this is one of your beats. You've been covering this for a while. Can you help us understand what is it like being a Christian in Syria, say, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war?
Well, the American audience, a lot of them, I'm sure, are aware of the violence of Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, ISIS. So these two groups have been targeting Syria since 2011, and their main targets have been Christians and other non-Muslims. So Christians have been exposed to many massacres, and their population was around 1.5 million before the civil war began in 2011. Today it's around 500,000. So many of them have been murdered, abducted, raped, tortured, and many of them have just left the country because there was no safety there. Imagine trying to survive under an Islamic State regime, under a very brutal, very anti-Christian, hateful, genocidal regime. That's the life of Syrian Christians right now.
So have Christians in Syria been facing this kind of extreme persecution in the past decade and a half, or does this go back farther?
Well, Syria used to be a majority Christian country since the 7th century. Then Arab Muslims came and conquered the land. They massacred many people and turned the survivors into dhimmis, second-class citizens or semi-slaves who had to pay high taxes in order to stay alive and to stay Christian. So this has been their life for centuries. But they've been so resilient, and in the midst of all this negativity and violence and oppression, many of them have kept their faith. And but we should remember that just because Muslims have taken over and it's a majority Muslim country now, Christians shouldn't have to suffer forever. They need protection, they need safety, stability. They need their own defense force because they cannot rely on the Al-Qaeda regime in Damascus for their own protection. We saw it again yesterday. A lot of people were massacred, and they went to this Sunday service without knowing what would happen. Actually, the massacre didn't come out of nowhere. The terrorists or jihadis, radical Muslims, have been threatening Christians for months now. They're leaving notes or, threats on the walls of churches saying, "You are next. Christians are next." So Christians there are just in the midst of this unstable and very violent environment. When they're attacked, when they are threatened, they have nowhere else to go, and the perpetrators are never brought to account.
So you sent me a bunch of articles that you've written detailing the persecution of Christians in Syria, but I have to ask you this question. There are certain people groups in certain places that the international community, the European Union, the halls of Congress get really passionate about, let's call it that, where everyone's up in arms and there's campus protests about certain people in certain situations. But then there's other people, other minorities that, for example, the Christians in Nigeria, the Christians in Syria, where it just seems like no one seems to care. And the only reason that this specific news story got headlines is because it's so graphic and it's so, dramatic, the suicide bomber. But for the most part, this kind of thing goes under the radar. Why do you think, as a whole, the international community, the international media, ignores stories like this?
Well, Christianity is today's most persecuted religion all around the world. That's the case in South Asia, in Africa, in all these African nations, Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and others. And in the Middle East, in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, everywhere Christians live under Muslim regimes or communist regimes, they are brutally persecuted. But the media in the European Union and other international institutions have just turned a blind eye. Why is that? I think it's because all these institutions have a narrative, a certain globalist narrative, in which they see Christians as the evil, criminal, imperialist, and colonizers, and Muslims as the victims. That's the only agenda and narrative they have. But when we look at the reality on the ground, in Syria, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, we see that Christians are murdered, abducted, they are forcibly married off to Muslim men. All their rights are persecuted. It's very, very difficult to survive as a Christian in all Muslim countries today. But these international institutions, including the legacy media, are blind to this reality because they have this narrative in which Muslims are the brown victims and Christians are the colonizers or perpetrators, which is false. And unfortunately, a lot of Western governments are now too secular or even anti-Christian and globalist. And unfortunately, when you have lost your identity, your faith, your belief in who you are, your faith in God, you don't care what those who believe in God and who follow Jesus go through. And that's another problem. That's one of the reasons why a lot of Western governments don't care today. And this must change. We need to change it.
Wow, that's extraordinarily clarifying. Uzziah, in closing, how should we be praying for the Christians in Syria? And tangibly, what can we be doing?
Well, I've spoken with several Christians there. Although they're very scared to speak to the press, we speak, privately. And they tell me that they need humanitarian aid, medical aid, especially after this terrorist attack. But more importantly, they need to have their own autonomy. We need to just help them in a way that they will become sovereign and they will have their own autonomous region or federal region or an independent state. Middle East Christians need to have their own independent state. If all these terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other authoritarian or genocidal groups or regimes can take over nations and they're recognized by the international community, by some EU governments, for example, why do Christians in Syria and other Middle Eastern countries not have their own autonomous region? They need to have their own defense force so that they'll be able to defend themselves. And we won't hear, horrible news that we heard yesterday again. That's how we should help them. The United States government has the power to make that happen. And we should help them, the Christians in Syria, be a sovereign, independent nation, or at least an autonomous region of their own.
Uzziah, well, God bless you. God bless your work. And thank you for coming on, my friend.
Thank you for having me.